Today's topic will focus on geolocation, the 10 main methods used to determine a user's geolocation. Literally within 1 minute, we will now set up the sound and our webinar will begin. So, the sound is checked, everything is okay. So, greetings everyone. Greetings everyone, Vector Tita3 is with you. So, geolocation is an incredibly important tool at the moment. Just 5 years ago, it was possible to completely ignore it, since geolocation was based only on determining an IP address. But now times have changed, and the more our computer, thanks to browsers, is integrated into the World Wide Web, the more we need to protect ourselves from determining our real geolocation. Both for privacy, anonymity, and perhaps to receive some bonuses and preferences from some services. But before we start our webinar today, I'd like to share a little news, as I traditionally do at the beginning of each webinar. So our first great news is the introduction of a new Telegram bot, or rather, the first Telegram bot. I get a lot of complaints about the work of supports, that supports take a very long time to answer user questions and so on. But when I go to the support accounts, I look at it, still perform a certain quality control and check what people write about. I can tell you this. Well, it's difficult, of course. I didn't do it in percentage terms. I can roughly estimate somewhere 85–90%. These are technical issues. At the same time, technical questions are incredibly simple. It seems that people have already ceased to understand how to use a computer and sometimes, well, just let's say questions. How to install the software? Well, this is already too much, you will agree. But also, of course, Windows 11 has brought us quite a lot of new interesting features that have been introduced, in my opinion, just to make our lives worse. Therefore, in order to relieve the load on supports, as well as to provide a high-quality level of service, I made a Telegram bot. But of course, this will probably not be something surprising for you. There are a lot of bots now, but this bot is not simple. I trained this bot as a Telegram bot, as tech support, and fed it the entire available database for Windows 10 and Windows 11 operating systems, all information on their APIs, the entire VirtualBox, and even VMware forums, since errors can sometimes overlap, and additionally, about 100. Consider the forums where people share various errors or tweaks. In short, computer nerd forums. These forums will allow the bot to navigate and help it solve your questions. We plan to launch the bot next week, so you can try it out. And this is a purely technical support bot. Did you get an error? Send a screenshot to the bot. Do you have a problem? Something doesn't start? Something you don't know? Send a message to the bot. It will help you in solving all your technical issues, I repeat. This will make our technical support service much better and much better. So I hope you enjoy it. Well, since we are talking about supports, we need to return to our physical, living people whom I love madly. I received 294 applications for a position in the support competition, which was held a week ago. This is a really large number, a very large number. I didn't expect so many applications, but unfortunately, I can say that in some cases, people were too far from understanding what a technical support agent should be. Therefore, unfortunately, only 12 people were selected to participate in the second round. Of course, I thank everyone and advise them not to be upset, and why I will say a little further. With regard to these 12 people whom I have singled out from the rest of the population, I would like to thank you for taking part in the contest, and I would like to say the following. Tomorrow, you will receive a short instruction on the second test. I hope this test is final, but again, if all 12 pass, we'll unfortunately need a third round. Here. But, nevertheless, I believe that the second round will be quite enough for us to decide on supports in the amount of 1 to 3 people. At the moment, we do not need to recruit technical supports for up to 3 people. Well, so I can wish everyone good luck. And tomorrow you will receive instructions from me in person. The list of all users who made it to the second round is published on the Vector T13 channel. Let's move on. Why should those people who did not get on this list or did not pass the test not be upset? The fact is that our company, Vector T13 Technologies, in 2026, a wonderful year, is aimed at a very serious expansion in all areas in which we work. And, in particular, even if you don't have technical knowledge, but for example you have knowledge in the banking sector, you understand what the answers of transaction codes are, you have your own developments in the field of credit cards, yes damn, even if you are previous, somehow, perhaps, in the distant past or in the distant future, in your fantasies. You're a carder? Then I think that the next contest will be up to you and you will like it. Because we will also need people who understand all the intricacies of the financial sphere of making online payments from the inside. We are expanding our bank card service. I remind you that for those who will watch this webinar and are not familiar with my services, we have a service for anonymous bank cards. You can create an unlimited number of bank cards, even a new card for each transaction. At the same time, we all have a large number of bins and a large number of countries. You can replenish card data using cryptocurrency. And I am so confident in your integrity that I will not ask you unnecessary questions. Accordingly, now let's return to the support position. I think that by the end of February, a competition for support in the financial sector will be announced, and we will need a person, so far one, who is very well versed in internet payments. So I recommend participating. You will find out about the start of the competition on my Telegram channel. Well, to other news. On the 12th of February, another webinar will be held. More precisely, this is our next webinar. In this webinar, I would like to cover one very important topic. Pod, in the comments under the previous video, one person said, "Why the hell do we need all these norms? You can just install Kubus, put Tor there, and that's it. In short, you're anonymous." Well, indeed, maybe this person is right, or maybe he is fundamentally wrong. Let's figure it out, because really, in the minds of many people, there is such a thing that, for example, you installed Tails for yourself, and everything is fine with you because Snowden advertised. Install Wonix, and you're fine, because Vector advertised it 10 years ago. I installed Kubus. It's not clear, but it also seems to have become some kind of cool hacker. Maybe someone also advertised this system. Therefore, on the 12th, I invite everyone to my open webinar, and we will analyze whether these systems are really so anonymous and safe, taking into account the current time, namely 2026. Let's move on. There is very little news left, and we will begin our main topic. Anti-detect type 9. I am infinitely proud of the release of this software, this kind of personal version. This one literally took a few minutes. This product is, in fact, truly revolutionary. I'll explain why. Because some techniques and geolocation determination, which we will analyze today, they were unattainable for correct change until recently. And thanks to the introduction of a revolutionary Wi-Fi emulation system, and you can see on your screens, and there are already more than 300 anti-detect type users, of which 250 there, give or take 5 people. About 250 people took part in a recent action. And so you will have the opportunity to test the system in practice. This system allows you to emulate 20 surrounding Wi-Fi networks, including all the necessary parameters, and most importantly, it allows you to add noise and variability. That is, the strength of the signal is constantly changing, hidden networks are constantly appearing, some networks fall away, others appear. In other words, the maximum realistic emulation of the surrounding networks is made. At first, Wi-Fi networks will need to be set manually, but literally in the next update we have already made a certain format, when you just set your geolocation in when creating a virtual machine and then put only one checkbox, and thanks to external APIs, there is an automatic substitution of the surrounding Wi-Fi networks for your checkbox. But let's not talk about it now. Pay attention to this. And when you get your software, you can check it all yourself. And we start issuing it on Monday, that is, the day after tomorrow. Let's move on to the next news. No less cool news, this system, which I implemented, is unrealistically cool. You will also like the following system. We are finishing the development of Android Anti-Detect. It will be available in all types of personal versions. Previously, it was stated that it would be available starting only with types number 4 and types number 5. And this is due to small architectural limitations, which I don't want to talk about now in the webinar. But now it's decided to add anti-detect support, specifically Android, to all types of personal versions. In Patreon, it is quite possible that Android support will appear by the end of summer or early autumn of this year. Well, in the version for exams, there is no point in adding Android at the moment. If, of course, there are some applications that work only through the phone for exams, yes, you can write to the supports, and of course we will consider this option. And in fact, I will tell you the key differences, why Android support in Anti-Detect is much better than Genymotion, BlueStacks, and so on. Here it is necessary to distinguish between very important concepts. There is the concept of simulation and there is the concept of emulation. That's all, and the current solutions that are on the market, software, I mean the same Genymotion, for example, BlueStack is an EMU, it's a simulation. That is, of course, this is not a real device, and moreover, a huge number of discrepancies with real devices. While in our case we're doing a simulation emulation, I'm sorry. You see, even I am already confused about these parameters. We emulate real hardware, and in particular, the most important thing that is only in every phone, you probably think that this is some kind of unique indicator there. No. This is a competent piece of hardware. That is Ion. You can run Android on a regular VirtualBox. You can download an Android image and run it directly in the standard Oracle VirtualBox, but There will be no hardware, there will be no hardware, there will be no NVRAM, there will not be a damn thing that the use of any simulators gives away. So, in the very near future, as soon as we deal with type number 9 and the next update for all personal versions, we will be ready, perhaps still in beta testing, but nevertheless, Android support will already be ready. Well, there is another system waiting for us. I'm not going to talk about it now for a long time, but after Android it's actually ready, both Android and this Chrome OS system. An interesting system that few people know about, but nevertheless, its results are fantastic compared to the Windows operating system. Let's move on. The next news is the introduction of your own cryptocurrency. And before you roll your eyes and say, "Another incomprehensible coin," I would like to give a little explanation. As at the last webinar, we talked about DAC 8 norms and current methods of anonymizing transactions. My team developed a blockchain, a real blockchain, not a token based on an existing cryptocurrency or blockchain, but a standalone blockchain that allows for transaction anonymization. Well, if you combine this with our wonderful bank card service, then we get incredible financial freedom. But of course, it is also worth talking about bad things right away. The bad things are that, I'll be honest, I don't really follow cryptocurrencies, and this area just is, but it doesn't get much of my attention. But nevertheless, sometimes from different, let's say, sources, I receive information that some blogger launched a cryptocurrency there. For several hours it grew, there by several thousand%, then it slipped below the plinth. In fact, I do not see such exceptions. I looked at it and really did not see any exceptions. Why? Because those currencies, they are not backed by anything. And they are designed only to collect money. That is, buy my candy wrappers from me, and that's it. That's how it is, how it works. Therefore, in my system, I want to do everything fundamentally differently. Our currency isn't speculative. Its growth will solely depend on its popularity, nothing more. That is, there are no several hundreds, thousands, or even, I think, even a few dozen X, you may not see, so you don't even need to buy it at the start. And even more, well, you don't have to buy it if you don't want to keep your transactions completely anonymous. Oh, so maybe someday it will become X2, maybe someday it will become X5, but this time will show, and show first of all, competent technical functionality. I'm not going to promote the currency much. Why? Because there is no point in it. Again, here, in this case, it is the functionality that is needed, the functional implementation of the token, and not PR. And in this case, PR will not even play into the hands. Let me explain why. Because the created currency is in fact a candy wrapper that is worth nothing. But if too much is known about it, then questions may arise for me. And I would not like to be specific because, as the experience shows, for example, of other currencies that try to be anonymous, they're delisting from exchanges, for example, and there are always questions to the creators. Even with Monero himself, if you dig in the direction of the team, an ordinary user may have a lot of questions. So for now, let's call this announcement a placeholder. Well, as soon as the currency appears, you will find out about it in the Telegram channel, and we'll see. I think that this experience will definitely be important, because this currency will allow you to do things that are not always possible to do with any other cryptocurrency. Well, of course, anonymous transactions. Well, that's it. At this point, a small block of news is over, and we can proceed to our main topic. Let me remind you that the main topic today is geolocation. 10 main techniques that allow you to change the user's geolocation, and not only will we make an overview, but also analyze how these techniques can be replaced. That's right, we need some kind of solution. Well, for those who watch my webinars for the first time, we really have a lot of such people, since our user counter has confidently crossed the mark of 400 people, and this is really cool. I see that I received a really large number of positive feedback on past webinars. So, for those who are not quite familiar with me, with my work, I would like to introduce myself. This will probably be the first webinar in history when I need to introduce myself. Who am I? I am Dimitri Momot, a researcher in the field of information security. The main, or rather not the main, first fame was gained back in the distant 2009 year when he hacked pirate servers of online MMORPGs and told on the forums how to perform certain manipulations with these servers, as well as how to perfectly master manipulation in the client-server segment. Since 2014, my activities have led me to information security in terms of providing services. Services to people who do not want to be noticed. And in particular, you can find a huge amount of information about me on one of the forums called Dark Money. Now, I am the owner of Vector T13 Technologies, which has recently become a whole conglomerate since we have a company in Ukraine, a company in the Netherlands, and also a company in the United Arab Emirates, in which I have the honor to be a resident. So, for those who will be in Dubai, for our future potential clients, you can always go to the office of our company, which is located in the Burj Khalifa, and also an additional bonus will be that you can admire the magnificent panorama of the beautiful city of Dubai from the height of the 125th floor. This is where our office is located. So write support, and I'll be waiting for you to visit. Well, for our current customers, I will always be happy to meet and miss a few shots of mezcal. Well, maybe not a few, but a little more. So our geolocation. Let's get back to it. The first primitive method is geolocation based on IP addresses. Here, I think, in principle, everything is clear to you. With this method of geolocation, in principle, anyone is familiar. This is geolocation using our IP address as the main identifier. An IP address is checked using public databases such as MaxMind. In fact, the entire geolocation world now relies on this company and its geobases. Well, in fact, everyone. Therefore, if suddenly here are users sometimes asking a question, we have an excellent service for a mobile proxy, and users sometimes use various kinds of checkers. Let's look at this case now. The user buys a US proxy, goes to some checker, and then makes a claim. Says, "Oh, why don't I have the United States but North Korea? Why do I now have Kim Jong-il on my entire monitor?" The problem is that there are a little more than 4 billion IP addresses in the world. The number of devices that are connected to the network is more than 30 billion. Of course, there are overnets, there are internal networks, but nevertheless, IP addresses are as if in a large concrete mixer. If some of them are static for several decades, others very often change their location. Therefore, an IP address that in 2002, for example, belonged to North Korea, relatively speaking, can now belong to the United States. Therefore, the best option to check your geolocation is not to use any checkers, but just go to the MaxMind website, where you can check your geolocation for free. Well, what is the reason for false checker data? I'll tell you. The fact is that MaxMind also has its own databases that leak to the public, and you can find MaxMind databases from 21, 22, even in the public domain on GitHub. Accordingly, in order not to buy such a complete database, some checker owners simply use outdated databases, although at the same time, MaxMind provides up-to-date databases on an absolutely free basis. So, when some web resource wants to determine your geolocation, all it needs is just to access the MaxMind database, and after that, it will know what information to show you, for example, or allow you to enter the site. The simplest example of this is bookmakers. We all know very well that, for example, you cannot go to the website of some bookmaker's office if you enter from a country in which bookmakers, or more precisely, gambling is prohibited, for example, or in which this company does not have a license. The simplest method is geolocation. And nevertheless, this method works at the moment, and we constantly encounter it every day. Depending on our IP geolocation, the web resource will offer us a certain translation for our region, for example, or functionality that is available only in our region and in no other. However, in addition to the IP address, there is also an ASN network. An ASN network is, in simple words, a conglomerate of IP addresses and networks. That is, an ASN network can look like, for example, 7.7.13.59. In total, there are a little more than 300,000 ASN networks in the world. At the moment, there are already about 350,000 or so networks. But we understand that there are 4 billion IP addresses, so all IP addresses in the world are combined into different ASN networks according to one or another characteristic by belonging to a certain provider, legal entity, and so on. So, despite the fact that the IP address is supposedly our main identifier, nevertheless the ASN network and its identifier are a little more important than our IP address because it is elementary to determine from ASN networks when the IP address belongs to a botnet, or rather, not a botnet, I apologize, hosting some, for example, a VPS service or a large hosting provider. For example, like DigitalOcean or Hetzner, which have their own networks. And ASN verification allows you not only to check your primary IP address, but also to check the IP addresses next to you and accordingly to draw a conclusion about your real geolocation, as well as about certain methods that can be applied to you. That is, again, if you come from an ASN network, which, for example, is based in, relatively speaking, North Korea, right? That's it. And there are only bots in this network. Well, accordingly, they won't show you anything good. I don't know why I feel this way today, and often mention North Korea. I usually mention Mongolia. So, how can you change the ASN? How can you change the IP address? Separately, you can change these parameters only if you change the IP address to the one that is part of this ASN network. But you can't leave the IP address and change the ASN network because the IP address is lower in rank than the ASN network. Therefore, the easiest method is to simply change the IP address. A proxy, a VPN, yes, anything will allow you to change your IP address, your ASN, and by extension, the region of your presence. This method of geolocation was the only one until 2007. That is, imagine, not so long ago, although no, damn it, a long time ago. 2007 was 19 years ago. It's an incredible time to rush. But nevertheless, this was the first technique in our today's webinar, and it is used both by web resources and local software. These are our two main subjects that interest us. Let's move on. The next method. The next method is called Traceroute. Surely you know what Traceroute is, or have anyone ever executed this command on the Windows or Linux command line? This command allows you to know how your traffic is going through how many nodes. Accordingly, when you, for example, have a target node in the United States, and you are, for example, in In Vietnam, your traffic will pass through, let's say, 12 different nodes. And if the target resource is also located in Vietnam, then your target traffic can pass through 4 or 5 nodes. And also, when performing Traceroute, it is also possible to determine which specific nodes your traffic passes through. And here I would like to highlight 2 interesting points. The thing is, Traceroute itself, it let's say only works locally. That is, web resources cannot perform this procedure, they do not have access. But even on a regular PC, in some cases Traceroute may not work due to firewall rules. But in addition to this, there is another very interesting method that I would like to introduce to you, which in principle can be indirectly considered the Traceroute method. The thing is that web resources, and you can check this using a service like BrowserLeaks. In the IP addresses section, you can see the number of so-called hops. So web resources for your TTL, time to live, and your network packets can determine how far away you are from them. The fact is that our TTL, the standard TTL that is formed by our operating system, it has a value of 128, just 128 units. Surely many of you are familiar with it. And on each of the nodes through which traffic will pass, this TTL parameter will be reduced by 1. Accordingly, if a packet with a TTL, for example, 118 reaches the required web resource, then the web resource can conclude that the traffic has passed through 10 nodes or through 11 nodes, since your router will add 1 to the TTL. So, it will change your TTL from 128 to 129 and send the packet with 129 TTL units. So this is a little life hack on how you can get closer to the desired location. For example, by the way, in my software, in Anti-Detect, such functionality was recently implemented. Incredibly simple, stupid, but nevertheless quite effective. And now, when using a VPN, for instance, a standard VPN might give you about 13 or 14 hops, let's say, on BrowserLeaks, but you can reduce that to, hypothetically, even just 1. But these are more laboratory tests. I do not recommend changing less than 7 hops, but this way you can get closer to the necessary web resource. If, for example, it is located, relatively speaking, in the United States and you are in Vietnam. So back to our traceroute. Regarding a traceroute similarity, which I just discussed for browsers, you simply need to change your TTL in the OS settings to get closer to the target client. However, a traceroute procedure performed via Windows tools or any software is easily remedied. Simply, ICMP traffic is disabled. This is done in the firewall properties, and you don't need to pay much attention to it here because you just need to block one protocol, and after that the traceroute will be impossible. This, by the way, is a fairly frequent policy. There is nothing abnormal in it. A frequent policy of various kinds of firewalls, which comes by default. Since this procedure is actually useless for an ordinary user. Therefore, let's summarize a little bit. Traceroute local can only be executed by local software, and this is cured by firewall rules. Well, the web traceroute, if you can call it that, analog, can be changed by changing the TTL parameter in your operating system. And it works on both Windows systems and Linux or macOS systems. Elementary simple, but nevertheless incredibly effective, because if there are 13 or 14 hops between you and your wonderful IP address and the web resource you are looking for, well, you will not look like any American. Well, no matter how hard you try. Let's move on. The next method, I hope you're interested. The next method we have is DNS. Here, I think everyone already knows everything, but I will try to surprise you with something anyway. So, how can we determine what we're using? More precisely, determine our geolocation. Well, certainly understandable. The DNS server has its IP address, and by analogy with geolocation, based on the IP address from point number 1, we can make a query where this IP address is with the MaxMind database and understand that we, for example, if we state that we are in the US by our main IP address, but our DNS is located, for example, in Vietnam, then accordingly this is hardly possible in reality. But in addition to this, there are several more interesting techniques. The first method is the so-called DNS suffix. It is not here on the slide, so you just need to perceive the information by ear. Very often, ISPs add a certain suffix to DNS requests, and this suffix, it is stored by your operating system and does not change even if you use a VPN. A simple example? Are wonderful, while living in the Netherlands with me, there the provider was the so-called Ziggo. And this provider Ziggo left its DNS suffix, and on my PC. And so I thought for a long time, why the hell do I have web resources opening in Dutch? And it turns out that I have a great DNS suffix that automatically informs me to another DNS server that I was contacting, that I was accessing from the Netherlands. Well, that's right, I exaggerated a little and let's just say generalized, but the essence is this. Therefore, I recommend that you just enter the command in the command line, a ipconfig in the settings, and see, respectively, whether you have a DNS suffix or not. It will be highlighted as a separate item. This DNS suffix will always be added to the DNS queries you send. But in addition to this, there are several more interesting points. There's a moment of this so-called eDNS client, and some people have done whole investigations about it, how important eDNS is, and so on. In fact, I will tell you from my practice, for some reason I do not pay much attention to it because I have never been able to find at least one client where it worked normally. But nevertheless, I simply have to mention it in passing. What else can our DNS please us? The fact is that depending on how our browser is installed, that is, for example, you installed the browser in one country, more precisely in your home country, for example, in Vietnam, then you added a proxy or a US VPN, then your DNS request can still go through Vietnamese DNS. Why? The fact is that the browsers themselves have a list of DNS servers that they access by default, that is, hard-coded servers. In particular, Google loves to do this. Therefore, one of the simplest techniques that allows you to de-anonymize the user and show his real DNS. But it is also possible to use another additional parameter for local software. This is the so-called DNS cache. The DNS cache that resides on your computer and the history of your DNS, which can be used by local software to understand where you are. In particular, it can also be a source of leakage of information about how you changed your location. Let me give you an example. You've created, for example, you have a laptop, a separate laptop that is connected, for example, to some powerful router on which a VPN is installed. Everything seems to be cool, everything seems to be fine. But if at some point your proxy or VPN on your router disappears, what could happen? If you don't have filtering rules configured or the same kill switch is not configured, then your laptop will still go online. Even though you won't be surfing on it or doing anything, the operating system will still break into the network. And accordingly, in the logs of the operating system, there will be a mention that at such and such a moment, the DNS address has been reassigned to a new one. And accordingly, after retrieving these logs, it's possible to determine using local software that the DNS change occurred. And only a person who knows that these logs need to be either turned off or cleaned will be able to bypass such a primitive, but nevertheless quite effective detection, because only few people know about it. But nevertheless, the operating system keeps many different secrets, which I recommend to pay your attention to and try to tell you about them as much as possible. Conclusion about DNS. Changing geolocation using DNS is simply treated. You can change your DNS, but if you do change it, at least change it correctly. How can this be done? Oh, or luck, which of course is excluded because it is probably easier to win the lottery. You can enter the IP address of your some IP from the subnet of your proxy. Or if you use a VPN, the VPN provider will most likely give you DNS. But there is one more option that I recommend using. On the detect.expert service, you can enter your IP address and then get DNS for it. At the same time, it's all absolutely free, so you can use it. But this is for web resources. And if you are working with local software, then you need to do the same. But I still recommend that you also clear the logs and completely clear the entire DNS cache. Fortunately, there is a command line for this, which allows you to do this with just a couple of commands. Well, we continue. And this was only the third method. The fourth method is more complex, more technological, and it is built purely on physical interaction. In this case, it is a GPS module. What a GPS module is, I think you all know very well, since you use modern tech, modern phones, but also, you surely know that many PCs also have a GPS module which receives GPS signals from satellites and, accordingly, shows your geolocation. This is a very serious and very complicated thing. Let me explain why. Because if you have such a module physically in your PC, it's extremely hard to fool it. Indeed, it is extremely difficult. For those who want, let's give an example. Okay, is iPhone geolocation hypothetically hard to fake? It's difficult. It's possible? Yes. With the help of specialized software, if, for example, the application is switched to the developer mode. But for standard PCs, for Windows or Linux PCs, I personally have not seen such software. If you have seen it, write in the comments to this video. What are the options? There are only two options. The first option is to simply turn off this device. In principle, there is no special anomaly in this, but of course it is not very desirable, since the GPS module and its presence, if you have it in the system, cannot be hidden. Even if you unplug the device, it will still be visible. Therefore, we move on to technique number 2. If you specifically need to change your geolocation using GPS, for instance, your software requires a GPS module, then you can use the Vector T13 anti-detect. Since in my software, I've implemented a fully independent device that emulates GPS signals. Plus, in the latest update, a more accurate geolocation has been added. That is, instead of 4 decimal places, we now have 7 digits, which allow you to calculate geolocation up to 1 meter. And also added small geolocation shifts, which allow you to fully emulate real data from the satellite. Since satellite data can still vary, and we didn't have this functionality before. Func geolocation has been static all the time throughout the life of the virtual machine. Now it gets a slight backlash, let's say, a slight displacement within a few meters, which fully emulates the real device. Well, I repeat, on ordinary PCs, unfortunately, I do not know any methods for replacing signals on a physical chip at the moment. Therefore, there are two choices: or use a device without a GPS module, or use an anti-detector from Vector T13, where you can replace geolocation without any problems. By the way, Windows Maps, among other services, relies on geolocation. All web resources can use data from your GPS module when accessing the geolocation API. You can check again on the Browser Leaks web resource in the geolocation section as an option. Well, let's move on. The next method. Today, I'm trying not to spend too much time on deep matters, as our last webinar stretched for 3 hours. In this webinar, I want us to keep within 2 hours maximum and not bore you with this beautiful Saturday night. Geolocation method number 5 is geolocation using Windows Update History. This method is only available for Windows and allows you to determine where and when your copy of the Windows operating system was updated. The thing is, Windows automatically checks your geolocation and it wants to download the update as quickly as possible to your PC. Accordingly, it will check which servers it should connect to, and, figuratively speaking, it can very well inherit in the logs. Not really, not even can't, but he will always inherit. Therefore, it will be known where which update was downloaded from. Since Microsoft not only has regional servers, but also Microsoft works very well with a system called Akamai, a system that we will also analyze today a little later. But thanks to their cooperation, the Windows operating system keeps logs of where which update was downloaded from. As such, local software can access these logs and determine where the update was downloaded from. And in this case, it will be very difficult to prove that, for example, you, as a US resident, for some reason decided to download an update to your desktop PC from Vietnam or North Korea, hypothetically. Therefore, a small detection, which is incredibly simple, but since few people know about it, this detection is It can often be the reason why, for example, your exam software will refuse to provide you with services. Because exam programs such as Respondus Lockdown Browser, Proctorio, or Safe Exam Browser utilize Windows logging systems to indirectly determine your geolocation. And so that it does not happen that, figuratively speaking, you left for another country for some unknown reason to take an exam. So pay attention to this. This method is not available for web resources, but it is available for local software. And it's very easy to clean, or rather change, this geolocation. You can either edit the logs and enter the Windows servers that you need, those Microsoft servers, I beg your pardon, or you can simply clear these logs, which is also not a critical detector and will allow you to bypass a system that uses SI logging as a geolocation technique. Next topic. The next topic is generally interesting. This is a system called MDNS. Surely many of you, when watching YouTube, see a picture of Chromecast, or rather, such a small icon. And this little icon, it allows you to stream what you're watching on your phone or on your PC. Well, it helps you stream to your TV or to some other device. This system is based on a technology called MDNS. For all of us, it is available in the following ways. To put it simply, a web resource can scan our local network and determine how many devices we have. We have already talked about this and shown it in the browser fingerprinting section. But in addition to the fact that a web resource can only see local IP addresses such as ours, if the scan is performed from inside the network, i.e. by local software, for example, there is a vulnerability that allows obtaining the external IP address of the device. And now I translate all this into human-readable language. The fact is that if you, having connected to your native Wi-Fi, use a VPN on which you want to say that you're a pure-blooded American, but your TV in the next room, a smart TV, is connected to the same router, but for example, the same VPN or proxy does not use, but uses a standard network connection. With MDNS technology, local software running on a PC with anonymization enabled can determine the external IP address of a device that is not anonymized. In other words, local software will bypass your VPN and proxy if it asks for your TV's IP address. It's simple. In general, the mechanics are quite complex to implement all this, but difficult in terms of understanding the structure of the network, and in fact to implement this is a couple of trifles. So you need to know about this method. And if web resources can only perform MDNS scanning of internal IP addresses, they will see how many devices you have on your network. Any web resource can do this. And the test is just in case. I don't remember whether I wrote at the last webinar or not. I'll send it to the chat now. You can, in principle, check all this on this web resource. Well, in general, in fact, this is not somehow some kind of higher matter. You can go to GitHub and you can find a large number of such tests. So, if a web resource can only determine internal IP addresses and compose, figuratively speaking, your fingerprinting of this kind, then local software can determine real external IP addresses. Therefore, it is recommended, of course, to do the following. There are two options. The first option is quite simple. You can simply disable the MDNS service. This service is disabled in the firewall settings. In any operating system, you can go and directly find the MDNS rules in the firewall. They are called that. This is option number one. Option number two, the most preferable, is to isolate work from your real life. This is the best option you can imagine. Although it is interesting if you go into subtle matters, what the web resource will treat better. What if it finds 5 more devices in your network, or if it doesn't find any in your network? But this is a ground for thought, and one might say homework. And now we move on to method number 7, and after it, we will literally take a 5-7 minute break, drink tea, smoke, and come back, because we will still have a lot of information. So method number 7. Method number 7 has already sounded today. This is our favorite Akamai. For those who are not quite familiar with the system, I would like to tell you that Akamai is the largest content provider in the world. In other words, a CDN network is a content delivery network. More than 200,000 servers around the world? When you watch Netflix, when you download a toy from Steam, when you download a Windows update, you're using Akamai's servers. In almost all 100% of cases, you probably use Akamai servers. And in this case, Akamai can, in addition to commanding the entire world of content, if, figuratively speaking, something happens to Akamai, then there will be a very big problem on the entire internet. But Akamai also has a few additional interesting features. These opportunities are due to the fact that Akamai invests a lot of money in the creation of its anti-fraud system. In particular, they have made a great product, one of the strongest, but in terms of scale, the largest probably, in terms of strength and know-how, I would still think. Oh, they made their own bot guard, a great product. In particular, I have already talked about it at previous webinars, so I will not repeat myself. For those who are interested, more 1 and 3 million web resources are connected to Akamai. And, in particular, one of the simple detectors of a bot is that an IP address has its own reputation. What was downloaded from this IP address? If you only installed a browser from this IP address, for example, installed a browser from this IP address 100 times in the last month, well, then there must be something wrong with this IP address. And if from this IP address, for example, you watched or downloaded some Windows updates, yes, there are no questions, everything is cool, there is trust in this IP address. But this is simple logic, let's say botguard. For those who are interested, go to YouTube and find a more detailed explanation. But Akamai also has a system that I haven't talked about before. This system is called ping pong, and not to be confused with the ping pong that you can see in the Thai backstreets. Here, ping pong is much more serious. The thing is, you're behind a VPN, behind a proxy, you can't fool physics. Unfortunately, we are not yet in a position to do so. Maybe in the future we can, but not now. If you're like me, for example, in wonderful, beautiful Dubai, but you want to show that you're a US user, okay, maybe you can do that, but not in the case of Akamai. Akamai will, since it has a huge network of servers, it can make all kinds of requests to you. That is, he can play with you from different servers, sending you questions, getting answers. And in this way, he can determine where the answer will come faster, where the answer will come longer. And accordingly, if, relatively speaking, you were in the United States, then the parameter that we all know called latency, and just in case, I recommend checking this parameter on the Cloudflare checker. So I lost my thoughts. Just a moment. So if you are, figuratively speaking, in Dubai, visit a web resource that is located in the United States and use a US proxy, then the latency parameter, which will indicate, relatively speaking, you can call it that, latency, and it will be much higher than that of a real user from the United States. At the same time, if you make a request to you from India or Oman or Saudi Arabia, the latency parameter will be much lower and will be much lower than that of a user from the United States. And so, relatively speaking, it is possible to triangulate by checking you from various sources. The method is very effective indeed because, according to Akamai representatives, they allow you to determine the user's geolocation behind the VPN and proxy up to the city. That is, to determine the country is already cool, but to determine the city is of course great. But all this is achieved due to a huge network of servers and competent positioning. So be sure to pay attention to this. This technique is available to both web resources and local software, since it can be performed from all sides, and thus your de-anonymization will not be difficult. Well, again, up to one city. Here, and neither a proxy nor a VPN will save here. There are a few tricks, of course, which I would like to tell you about. Trick number 1, which is not feasible in practice, but nevertheless, I would like to at least mention it. The fact is that you can deceive yourself, you can deceive physics a little, you can move yourself if you use several VPNs at the same time. Ravings of a madman, right? But if you think about what I have said, surely you will be able to find a solution. Imagine that your traffic does not go through one IP address, or rather not through one tunnel, but goes through several tunnels at once. I'm not taking separate VPNs now, as you would then have 3 different IP addresses and the routing would go crazy. No, but the fact is that there is a certain technique with which you can increase the speed of your VPN and reduce the latency parameter if you connect to the same VPN several times. Well, provided, of course, that this VPN will be on a server that is more or less at least fast. Here, but this is homework for researchers. If you are interested, maybe I'll show it in practice, because in fact it sounds like complete nonsense, but still I managed to implement it, so you'll surely succeed too. But the simplest method, if you don't want to bother yourself with such idiocy, and if you are not a nerd, then there is no other way to call it idiocy, is a very simple solution. Just use remote production servers. After all, it's so wonderful when you take it for yourself. You work in the United States, rent a remote physical server there, install your anti-detections on it, and you will be happy. You'll see how much your performance will increase, because in this case, communication will be between your server in the US, your proxy in the US, and your web resource in the US. And you, who are in Vietnam, you will communicate with your server using a completely different protocol, the RDP protocol, for example. And you, accordingly, won't have to worry about your latency parameter being very, very high. So take it as a free tip. Well, at the moment, we have already passed the first hour of our webinar, so let's take a short, literally 5-7 minute break and then continue our webinar. I have something else for you very, very interesting. And of course, do not forget about geocompliance. Today, we will talk about it separately, about this magnificent system and how to work with it. In the meantime, let's take a break and some music. There was an opportunity to take a little break from absorbing knowledge, and we can continue our webinar today. The next technique, geolocation technique number 8, is the simplest of all the techniques presented today, but nevertheless incredibly effective. And it still remains a mystery to me why users either do not know about it, or try to ignore it in every possible way, because in most cases this was the cause of any problems. This is the so-called geolocation technique using interface ping. I would like to say right away that this technique is not available for web resources, but it is available for browsers. What's it? So let's imagine that you are running a VPN on your PC, and even after that you go to some other checker site, which shows that you are really now in the United States and everything is cool, everything is okay. But you didn't start the VPN, and for example, you didn't pull the network card out of your computer, right? You probably still use it, your real network card, with which you connect to the internet. This means that the simplest detection method is to poll all network interfaces. That's it. That is, in fact, if you have launched a VPN, any local software, by polling the network, interfaces on your PC can determine that one IP address is from the United States and the other IP address is from Vietnam. That is, your native IP address. And this technique is applicable both for local software and not for web resources, but for the browser. Let me explain why I am immediately speaking for the browser. The thing is, Chrome, our beloved browser, which is practically unrivaled right now, really likes this method. In its operation, it polls interfaces for external IP addresses. This technique allows the Google ecosystem to always know what such and such a user has, and it identifies you using the xClient data headers. It draws attention to the fact that a certain user always has several IP addresses from different parts of the world. And so in this case, again, the US server is a great technique. But if you don't want to spend money on this, then either using an anti-detect router to which your PC will connect, or using a physical router where accordingly a proxy will be installed or a VPN will suit you. Thus, you will have only one network connection on your computer, a real one, through which you will connect to the router and so on. This method is widely used and is always a must-have in all anonymity systems, absolutely all of them. That is, if we are talking about anonymity, where a VPN is launched as a separate network connection, then who came up with such an anonymity system? A complete idiot, or rather who implemented it, a complete idiot. Of course, there are some exceptions, but still, in most cases, this is the case. Because any local software is also browsers, will always determine your real IP address by polling network interfaces. So don't forget about it just the next time you work with certain resources. And just because your current software doesn't use this technique, for example, doesn't mean it won't use it after a while. Because the technique is ancient, but nevertheless incredibly effective, since almost no one talks about it. I haven't even seen any mention from any techies that this technique is worth any attention. So I draw your attention to it now. So let's move on. Geolocation, method number 9, with the help of Bluetooth. Surely you often use Bluetooth on your phones, or for instance, when you walk through a large supermarket, you can frequently download software that helps you navigate it. This happens with the help of Bluetooth technology. If you use AirTags, that is for example Apple Tag or some other variations of such tags, then Bluetooth geolocation is also used there. The so-called Bluetooth beacons are used. We will not dive too deep into this topic now, since anti-fraud systems use Bluetooth geolocation only on phones, but nevertheless, the possibility of using it exists on real PCs. My apologies here, I made one inaccuracy. Not only on phones, but also on tablets. This is very important. However, on real PCs running Windows, using Bluetooth geolocation on desktops is utterly pointless, as Bluetooth has very low signal strength and limited coverage. However, there is an investigation where, thanks to the use of Bluetooth geolocation and nearby devices, it was possible to determine the location of the real user. These cases are mainly related to the special services, China, and leaked to the network either on purpose or due to some leaks. This method is also used by special services worldwide, because your phone can scan everything around it, and accordingly gain access to the geolocation of other devices from real users, even if your device is supposedly pseudo-anonymous. But in the context, we are not very interested in this, because again, I have not seen a lot of software that uses the Bluetooth geolocation technique. But in simple words, running Bluetooth geolocation on a device that supports Bluetooth can scan the devices around you and thus determine where exactly you are. Well, in fact, this is all that can be said without any subtle matters, because this topic does not deserve an in-depth discussion, unlike topic number 10, the final topic of our today's webinar. And I suspect that many of you have come precisely because of this topic. Geolocation using Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi geolocation is currently the most technologically advanced, high-tech, or more precisely, and most widely used method of geolocation of a user, as it is used by a browser, local software, Windows operating system, and a host of other applications. And the trick of this method is that it is very difficult. It is very difficult to overcome it, but nevertheless it is possible. What methods can be used to overcome it, we will now consider. But first, a little theory. What is Wi-Fi triangulation? When you start your Wi-Fi device, whether it's a module in your phone or a module in your computer, it scans the surrounding Wi-Fi networks. And it is possible to obtain information of the following nature. SSID, that is the name of your network, well, the name of all the surrounding networks, right? Every network has its own SSID, and it's either M as we see it, or it's hidden. This is already called a hidden network. That is, in fact, a hidden network differs from an open one only in the absence of the SSID parameter. And in fact, it seems to exist, but it is negative. Well, if I can call it that, negative probably. No, we'll say he doesn't exist, because otherwise I'll confuse you. The SSID may or may not be present. It's normal, but this is the network ID your device connects to, located near it. The second identifier is the BSSID identifier, which is the MAC address. But surely you think that the MAC address in this case is the MAC address that you enter when you configure your router for the first time? Not really. A Wi-Fi router can have multiple MAC addresses. This first MAC address is the MAC address of your network port, your network card, to which the internet cable connects. You can change it, and the rest of the MAC addresses are almost inaccessible for change. If you have several Wi-Fi modules, then in this case you will have several MAC addresses, and in most routers you cannot change them using the control panel. The third signal and the third network identifier is the signal strength. The fourth identifier is the channel that is, for example, 2 and 4 GHz, or channel number 6, or channel number 11, 5 GHz, and also the presence of encryption. This whole stack is like this. It forms information about the Wi-Fi network, and all the Wi-Fi networks that surround you, they have this information with the exception of hidden networks which only do not have an SSID, but nevertheless, they are still visible to any scanning device. Accordingly, having received information about the Wi-Fi networks around you, local software, or a browser, or a web resource can make a request to one of the public databases in which information about worldwide Wi-Fi networks is stored. This can be the simplest option. It can be the Google Geolocation API. In particular, I have a utility called Spy Wi-Fi on the detect.expert web resource. Spy Wi-Fi utility performs all these manipulations absolutely free, without registration and without SMS. You can download it, it will get a list of the Wi-Fi networks around you, then make a Google request, and then return you your exact location as well as the accuracy radius of the detection. The detection accuracy radius is a crucial parameter, as incorrect Wi-Fi network emulation can result in, for example, a detection radius of several kilometers, which would certainly be an anomaly and non-existent in the real world. Here is the simplest method, and in fact it is really very simple. Collected information, sent it to Google, received an answer, that's it. This simplest method is the holy grail for many users at the moment. Why? Because betting companies use this technique to determine the geolocation of the user. But, in addition to the fact that betting companies use this, many banks use the same system. And interestingly, for some reason, many of these banks are located in Brazil, Argentina, and so on. In fact, all the bank clients I have worked with, they use geolocation using Wi-Fi. It's unclear why, I haven't really seen this in other countries, but the banking network in South America, especially Mercado Pago, Mercado Libre, they use Wi-Fi geolocation to determine the user's location, respectively. Perhaps this is related to kidnapping, perhaps something else, who knows. But nevertheless, the fact remains. And due to the fact that Wi-Fi networks have such a parameter as signal strength, then by correlating the data, you can triangulate and understand where, relatively speaking, you are in the middle, and there are various Wi-Fi networks around you above, below, side, in front, behind. And thanks to the determination of the signal strength to these Wi-Fi networks, it is possible to determine your geolocation with an accuracy of several meters. Generally, it's defined up to 30 centimeters apparently, but in fact, it's only proven up to 1 meter, which is already an excellent method of geolocation. And in particular, I would like to explain another very important point that concerns this geolocation. What we have just discussed with you is Wi-Fi geolocation. It is not, in principle, it is quite easy to replace it. How to replace it, I will tell and show you today. But there is another method, and this method is now on your screens. Before that, I talked about 9 basic geolocation techniques. A few more could be singled out, but they are too indirect and do not deserve special attention. But if we draw an analogy, there is a whole complex called GeoGuard from GeoComply. So, this is not a separate technique, it is, let's say, a whole stack of techniques because it uses almost everything that we have discussed today. GeoGuard is software installed on a user's computer to determine their precise geolocation and, accordingly, permit or restrict them from performing certain operations on a web resource or other local software. In particular, I gave an example, for example, with online gambling platforms. A vivid example. When I first encountered GeoComply in 2021, everyone was seeking a solution for working with them, and I found it in just a few days. The solution was used as follows. In the Bet365 provider, there was a promotion that new accounts received $500 free deposit. That is, you register an account, you get $500 on this account. But it was necessary to be a clear user from New Jersey, from the state of New Jersey. So why such a reason? Are there any New Jersey users privileged or something like that? No. In fact, if it were up to Bet365, they would allow you to enter from anywhere from any IP address, just log in. The trick is that when a betting company gets a license and enters a new market, they naturally want to attract users from other existing betting companies in that market. So it's very common to see huge, really big stocks. In my opinion, the biggest and the most record breaker was the William Hill Betting Company, which gave $2,021 for registering a new account. That is a pretty good amount if you understand how to scale it correctly. But in particular, I would like to mention that companies in this case do not pursue the goal of de-anonymizing you and so on. They unfortunately have to obey local laws. And if there is a state in which they are licensed, and there are states in which their activities are not licensed, then if they provide their services in states in which their activities are not licensed, they will violate federal law, and accordingly, sanctions will be applied to them. Judicial investigations, and so on and so forth. In general, huge, huge hemorrhoids. And in order to save themselves from these hemorrhoids, companies use various kinds of solutions. There are two most popular solutions on the market. The X-Point solution, which is less popular, and the GeoGuard solution from GeoComply, which is the most popular. The GeoGuard solution allows you to use a whole stack of checks. Checks for the IP address itself, checks for the use of VPN or proxies, checks for the use of network anomalies in the user's PC settings, for DNS manipulations, for manipulation with hidden proxies. That is, when, for example, a computer is used as part of a botnet, for example. And also, of course, it's worth mentioning that they also check our operating system, but more on that later when we get to the virtual machine detection section. And in fact, the GeoGuard system has three main states: allow status, deny status, and redirect status. The redirect state raises the most questions, since the redirect state is very rare and is mainly aimed at interacting with the support team. But what's interesting is that in the GeoGuard system, it's different from all the others, because it doesn't just check you when you come in at the moment of critical actions, right? That is, what critical actions do we have? This is a login. This is, for example, password recovery. This is a deposit or withdrawal of a deposit. These are critical actions. During all other actions, anti-fraud systems are mostly inactive because there is no point in them straining. But when you have GeoGuard running, you have it running and is active for the entire time you are active on your computer. That is, in other words, it also checks yours online. Cool, right? So he can lock you out at any time if his machine learning or the models he's learned reveal something suspicious about you. Therefore, very often, when working with GeoGuard, there is such a tendency that the user, A, gets approved, creates his own account. For example, everything is cool, but then after a while, he gets banned, and he does not understand why this happened. And there can be a huge number of reasons for this. Starting from the fact that his proxy could crash and his real IP address could leak, and ending with the fact that the system thinks that you are too aimed at working with it. And here there is an interesting such option. I would like to tell you about it. The fact is that betting companies are interested not only in providing services to make money, but also in preserving that money. And accordingly, in this case with GeoGuard, they came up with the idea of fighting multi-accounting in the following way. After all, it would seem that we can take with this knowledge that we have, go to New Jersey, buy laptops, do everything we need, and actually live well. The system thought so, and they did the following. Now, among other things, it is also necessary to observe online. That is, when we go to a web resource that works with GeoGuard, we download the software, install it on our PC, and then this software hangs in our tray. We work with a web resource. We don't work. It hangs in the tray. Yes, of course, we can close it, turn it off, but the system will also register it, and accordingly, it will ask the question, why does this person only use a computer when visiting our website? This is suspicious, and accordingly, it will either redirect or prohibit that user from accessing a particular web resource, such as a betting company. And there are quite a lot of such methods, very simple, but nevertheless effective, in the GeoGuard stack. And the popularity of this software lies in the fact that, in fact, very few users in the world can bypass it, and bypass it, most importantly, competently. High detection accuracy, minimized blocking errors, full system access, and excellent machine identification combined with adaptive threat learning truly make it a market leader. If we take local anti-fraud systems, that is, with the help of local software, then I would definitely single out this system as top, better than all the others. Because even the same X-point, it unfortunately, well, or fortunately for us, of course, it does not reach it, not up to GeoGuard's functionality, and they may not have a very advanced machine learning system. Who knows? Nevertheless, such a trend exists. In the web anti-fraud stack, specifically browser-based systems, ThreatMetrix stands out as the unequivocal leader. ThreatMetrix is the top in de-anonymizing users, although Akamai is hot on its heels. Well, there is no equal to GeoGuard in local software. In the reverse, I found more than 220 parameters that can be read from the user's PC. And interestingly, 2021 years, we worked with GeoGuard in version 3.1.13. 2026, 5 years have passed, we are working with version 3.1.13. Not a single update during this time. Cool, isn't it? But in fact, there is nothing to update. All the information that was read initially, back there, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, it is still being read now. It's just that the method of processing it has changed on the back-end side. Incredibly cool solution. But in fact, if we take all the methods I've discussed today, GeoGuard uses them all, except for Akamai and Bluetooth. All other techniques are used to determine the user's geolocation. Here I have highlighted them in a separate scheme. And of course, the most complex methods for work, the most complex methods of substitution are the physical ones. Physical, such as GPS and Wi-Fi triangulation. These are the most important and most difficult systems to replace, because even the same Bluetooth can be replaced, even if you used it replaced. In fact, it's just a couple of trifles. Therefore, to summarize briefly, the simplest yet unreliable methods are geolocation using IP address, DNS, Traceroute, Windows Update, Chromecast, and Bluetooth. Elementary simple, nothing complicated. More complex, but nevertheless easy to replace anyway if you know about them, are the interface ping system and Akamai ping pong. Just one server in the US solves the entire stack of problems. Well, the high complexity of the substitution is GPS, Wi-Fi triangulation, and a full range of GeoGuard techniques. Let's now look at how it is possible to replace the use of a Wi-Fi network. Because, as I said at the beginning of our webinar, we went through each of the points, how to replace. Accordingly, it is necessary to report the same thing to Wi-Fi. I must say right away that the following photos are unreal. They are drawn by a neural network, but they are based on absolutely real cases that were invented by some users. And let's consider them. Wi-Fi spoofing. On Wi-Fi triangulation spoofing, Wi-Fi data can be based on completely different methods. The simplest, I would say, probably the first method that appeared, is McRotic routers. Why McRotic? Because the cheapest router model allows you to change the MAC address of the wireless network. And even in the distant 2021 year, I also advised users to use McRotic in order to emulate the surrounding Wi-Fi networks. So, McRotic routers, each of them will be an external Wi-Fi network, and at the time of 2021, we took the data from the open source Weigel.net. But after a complaint from GeoComply, they blocked access to the sources even for unregistered users. In this way, they wanted to fight, but they did not succeed, as well as we did then, 6 months later. So, when we have an arsenal of routers, each of which is a source of signal, then there is a problem. The problem is that our planet is urbanizing at an incredible pace, and unfortunately for the most part, we are located in metropolitan areas, which have a huge number of surrounding Wi-Fi signals. And some bright head came up with the idea that it was necessary to use the so-called jammer. A jammer, or simply a signal blocker, that allows to jam surrounding Wi-Fi networks. But because our emulated routers will be close to the signal source, the router's broadcast and the Wi-Fi dongle, pictured in the middle as the white box, receives the jammer won't affect them. Its power is insufficient, so external networks will be jammed. Well, the methodology, let's put it this way, I'll say so. Why? Because, first of all, it is very inconvenient, of course, to constantly manually change information about Wi-Fi networks in this router, in these routers. Find correlate again. But Wi-Fi jammers very often like to turn off and give a certain failure. What kind of failure? Such that some external network can leak, and accordingly your favorite Vietnamese network that you connect to, or the network of your neighbor who has maximized its power so that he even has Pornhub in his garage, can make you a very big problem, and your account will get banned. But also, among other things, users very often forget that in addition to visible networks, there are also hidden networks that can also have a strong signal. And just because you don't see these networks in your Windows window to connect doesn't mean they don't exist. And in particular, I would also like to note the following important point. The fact is that if the user does not live in some large metropolis, he may think that by turning off Wi-Fi, everything will be cool just at home. Such cases have indeed occurred in practice, but in fact, the Windows operating system sees a lot more Wi-Fi networks than you see, and it only shows you the networks that you can connect to. In fact, you have, figuratively speaking, 5 networks there, to which you can connect by the decision of the Windows operating system. In addition, you might have 50 networks with very weak signals that are still detected by your Wi-Fi adapter. But Windows thinks there's no point in showing them to you, because you won't be connected to them anyway. Therefore, isolating only visible networks does not solve this issue. And for this, they came up with this simple scheme. Here, but the scheme is not very good. Why? Because in this case, in addition to the inconvenience of work, you also get the following. All your Wi-Fi routers are close to the receiver, and this cannot happen in reality. Accordingly, in our ordinary life, routers surround us at a distance of several meters or several tens of meters. This is how the triangulation procedure occurs. And if all these routers are located at one point, then this is already an anomaly. This cannot happen in reality, and they tried to modify this scheme. I will show how they tried to modify this scheme. To avoid working with routers and manage things more centrally, we used the so-called ESP32 board. Here it is in this picture on the left. And the 32 ESP card allowed you to create, if I'm not mistaken, up to 64 networks. And that is translated, broadcast these networks and replace the MAC address, that is SSID and BSSID. In principle, everything is cool, everything is fine. Plus, you could even abandon the jammer and abandon in favor, for example, of some Wi-Fi adapter from which to unscrew the antenna. In fact, the scheme was full of feces and worked extremely unstable. And not a single solution that could more or less normally work with this scheme I personally have not seen in practice, because even with the antenna unscrewed, you can only work if you know one interesting life hack. But people didn't all know about it, so they came up with this crap. Crap called Faraday's box in general is a derivative of Faraday's cage, but nevertheless it is specifically Faraday's coffin, there Faraday's trough. In short, some bullshit with the word Faraday needs to be invented. By the way, who doesn't know Faraday is our most famous physicist, if I'm not mistaken, English or Australian? Well, it doesn't matter. So, the idea was to remove the surrounding Wi-Fi signals by isolating the receivers and transmitters in one single area, that is, in the area of, for example, a Faraday cage. The Faraday cage is a shielding element that does not allow signals to enter or exit, respectively, to the outside. However, for creating a Faraday cage, numerous methods can be applied. Their essence is the same, just different materials. Faraday paint, Faraday wallpaper, Faraday fabric, Faraday mesh, various kinds of shielding element. So, seemingly all is well here, and in practice, such a scheme can indeed be implemented, but there are a few buts. The first but, about which users who did not study physics at school forget that this box also needs to be grounded. Otherwise, it will not work a damn thing. But among other things, the biggest problem was precisely the problem that all sources of signal transmission will be located at a distance of a few centimeters from the source of signal reception, which, again, in fact is impossible in real conditions. Because, as I said earlier, there must be several tens of meters between devices to correctly emulate signal strength. Otherwise, we get ideal laboratory conditions. But there are a few more interesting options. This Faraday box could be simply replaced with just one Wi-Fi whistle, figuratively speaking, the same TP-Link as I drew here. This TP-Link has the antenna unscrewed, and then the TP-Link is plugged into the correct powerful USB jammer. What is a dimmer? I apologize, not a jammer, but a dimmer. The dimmer allows you to adjust the voltage, and thus, the less voltage you supply to your Wi-Fi dongle, the fewer networks it will detect. And in fact, thanks to this simplest method, you don't need any cage, not a box, nor nothing else. You just need the right dimmer, which, due to the fact that the resistance force will grow, will not overheat. And in this way, it is possible to reduce the RUT, the detection radius of Wi-Fi networks, to only 1 meter. This is exactly what has been tested in practice. Again, the photos were generated by the Nana-Banana neural network, but the essence is actually the same. But there's also a very, very, very bad thing, again, in this system. And this drawback is that we again resort to laboratory conditions, and in these lab conditions it will always be clear that the signal strength doesn't match what might be in practice. That is, all networks are at one point. In fact, this is how it happens. Therefore, what other options are there? I will tell you another rather interesting option. This is an option. When people also put it into practice, it's true. I'm already telling stories. Let's put it this way. USB over Ethernet or USB over IP. People who chose to be very enterprising paid their acquaintances and acquaintances of acquaintances in New Jersey to buy Wi-Fi dongles and insert them into their PCs when running the software called Kernel Pro. And this way you could access Wi-Fi networks from New Jersey while being, say, in Birobidzhan. And you really, thanks to this software, you see these Wi-Fi networks with a little bit of shamanism, of course, but you see it nonetheless. But all these methods, absolutely all these methods, they failed. They failed for several reasons. The number one reason, which I have already mentioned in advance, is the laboratory conditions, and in practice, they are different. That is, the fact that you can spoof geolocation, for example, and some software will show that you are really in New Jersey, does not deprive you of network anomalies, which will be very complained of by the same geocomply. Therefore, by placing all the devices for transmitting information and the source of receiving this information in some isolated area, it will work in the laboratory, but it will not work against the same GeoGuard, since in the real environment around us, the routers are located at a distance of several tens of meters. Plus, you have enabled, for example, AirDrop on the phone. Do you ever turn it on? Well, or something like that. A hidden Wi-Fi network appears. You connect to your TV. In some cases with TVs, you can connect to your refrigerator via the same Wi-Fi. Your neighbor turns on some information, or simply the signal strength drops just because someone walked by. There are a huge number of variations, and always the radio environment, it is not static in real life. That is, it is constantly changing, and the strength of the signal, even before your home router, it can change 1,000, 10,000, 100,000 times during one working day. Accordingly, if you read this information for a very short period of time, just 10 or 20 minutes, it is possible to get information that the networks are absolutely stable, and accordingly, there is either emulation or they are all at the same point, and thus some system is used. Spoofing geolocation. Therefore, the use of such materials is, of course, good. But again, I repeat, only in laboratory conditions, and in real conditions it would be necessary to make not a Faraday cage, but it would be necessary to do something like Faraday's apartment, where routers would be needed. Distribute them across different rooms, then shield the entire apartment so no other surrounding Wi-Fi networks can be detected. Well, in such a system, even more or less, maybe something would have worked in some way, but in fact, except, let's say, the statement that everything works, alas, no methods were found. Well, I personally did not have any methods. In fact, I'd highlight just a few methods currently available for correctly spoofing geolocation. The first technique is quite simple. This is the hook technique. The fact is that GeoGuard will access the surrounding Wi-Fi networks using the so-called Windows WLAN API. The request can be skipped, or rather, the request can be skipped, but the response from the WLAN API can be modified using Windows hooks. Fortunately, we now have neural networks that allow us to write Windows hooks, especially DeepSeek, without any problems. The second technique that can be used is modified devices. And most devices, or rather, not most, but many devices, have their own open source code that has leaked to the internet. And accordingly, by simple modifications, you can make the same devices work a little differently. Well, or the third option, which I have implemented in my software, is a completely new device that allows you to do what I tell him. The method is the most difficult of all, since it requires writing a full stack, that is, the virtual device itself, plus a driver for it, and plus making it all work correctly. And why it should work correctly, I will tell you now. Otherwise, the only physical method is Faraday's apartment, which you can see now on your screens. But even though you can build yourself a Faraday apartment, there's one more thing, as Steve Jobs said, that won't let you work properly. Here she is! This is the so-called multi-ID identification in GeoGuard. What does this mean? If GeoGuard software was just installed on your PC to check geolocation, we would lose a huge number of problems that users face on a daily basis. In reality, if we reverse engineer the GeoGuard client, we see all hardware info is read and forms a single ID. All information about drivers, so that there are no fake drivers or hook drivers, which I talked about earlier, all information about drivers is read and formed in the ID. The operating system is formed into several identifiers, in particular, specific telemetry data that is created by the Windows operating system itself, plus identity data, plus the identifiers of our user, plus the identifiers of the specifically installed operating system are also formed into one single ID, plus the installed software, which is checked for any malware, anything anomalous, since the cases can then be considered and are also formed into a single ID. And it would seem you could just reinstall, add some program, or modify an ID in Windows with CC tools, and everything would change. But in reality, no. The thing is, GeoGuard implements a procedure called phase hashing. The hashing phase procedure allows you to ignore up to 30% of the changed information. In a stack of 4 main ID groups, ignoring even 30% of information is still key to success, as it allows full user identification. Let's add to this some points. Recently, we have studied what a TPM chip is. Accordingly, the data from the chip's TPM, secure boot is mandatory, TPM chip is required, TPM chip certification is mandatory. That is, everything that can be taken from the TPM is also used by GeoGuard. Information about whether a virtual machine is being used, plus virtual machine detection techniques, is also used by GeoGuard. And of course, what we talked about, these methods, yes, is not always working. Because if you use, for example, this on a laptop and want to implement the following scheme, for example, take a huge number of old laptops, a huge number of Wi-Fi whistles, and use one laptop, one account, then you, unfortunately, will not be able to do it either. Why? Because the system prohibits normal work. If you have a built-in Wi-Fi module, the system deems using an external one inefficient and anomalous, thus wanting to remove it, so you use the real Wi-Fi module. And there, alas, it will be extremely difficult for you to change the voltage, and accordingly, you will still see the Wi-Fi networks around you. Therefore, at the moment, there are only a few options for how and when you can work with this network correctly. And in particular, one of the simplest options, I will now write it in the chat and then explain why I did not make a separate slide for it. Because perhaps this information now it will not get into, but YouTube. Well, whoever came to the webinar came. What is Infinix? Infinix is a mobile phone. This mobile phone is not that simple. I want to tell you a story now. The story is about, let's imagine, this is a fairy tale from the T13 vector. The fairy tale from the T13 vector is that a certain group of people in a certain administrative territory, by prior conspiracy, decided to carry out distribution. Let's put it this way. How to put it simply? I decided to huckster. Narcotics is the distribution of narcotic substances. So, in order to be anonymous, this group of people was very smart, and they went to a notorious forum on the internet where they bought phones with an IMEI changer. Imagine cunning pots? Here was just one problem with these phones. When they pressed the word 6 words on their phones, their IMEI changed. Indeed, yes, there was always a new IMEI. Cool. Very advanced phones. If you run an application that allows you to get information about your RF module ID, everything will change there too. Well, just beauty, you will agree. But now let's stick to the IMEI, because it is phones with a changeable IMEI that are most popular on the internet now. Really? If you want to be anonymous and you need a phone, so no matter what application they run on their phones bought for as much as $1,000, it always showed that the functionality for changing the IMEI worked. But the problem was that the person who sold these phones with a changeable IMEI was either alternatively brilliant or just didn't give a. I think that there were both options. The fact is that in phones, the IMEI and all other information identifying the phone, it is located in the so-called NVRAM module, non-volatile area. And AS, software like Xpost or the like, they do nothing more than intercept requests. That is, in other words, when software, programs, or a service makes a request to the NVRAM in order to find out IMEI, then the Xpost module, for example, it simply replaces this data. But what the fuck happens when a real cell phone signal is used? And it's not happening at all. Because the Xpost Nahera module is not working at this point. And accordingly, what the little man saw that was changing on his phone did not change a damn thing in the cellular network. Here is such an interesting story, how in fact the special services are fucking and will be fucked by the special services of all anonymous people who have one extra chromosome. So don't forget about it. If the phone really changes the IMEI, you can check it only with the help of IMSI Catcher or with the help of HackRF, BladeRF. So why am I saying all this? There is such a model of phones, more precisely, a brand of phones called Infinix. And great devices that allow you to change everything, all information about yourself, and absolutely standard methods. So I would recommend, if we analyze the physical method of change so that there is an opportunity to replace, and the identifier of the device itself and so on, I would recommend users to pay attention directly to the brand of Infinix phones. Of the FVAC, of the physical solutions at the moment, this is probably the only one in terms of phones. In terms of laptops, it is also important that there are laptops of this brand. Framework brands are also great for working with GeoGuard, as they allow you to change the hardware without changing the device itself. But of course, you will have to bother with installing the operating system and everything else. But alas, there is no getting away from it. Which, by the way, will also need to be done in Infinix phones, but it is much easier to do it in Android. Moreover, all standard methods, they are very well automated, so that, and changing all identifiers and reinstalling the operating system takes place in just one keystroke or in one click of the mouse on, in fact, the main PC. But then again, it's a device you can work with. What about the surrounding Wi-Fi signals? With ambient Wi-Fi signals, you need to use the same Faraday apartment I talked about. Because if you live in a metropolis, this is your only option. Well, or take it, a bunch of routers, grab your framework, laptop, or mobile device and head out into nature. Spend time productively and also work. Well, it's like such options. If you know of any other alternative versions, you can share in the comments below this video, as I suspect that I will learn a lot of different kinds of inventions and know-how from the comments to this video on YouTube. Well, in turn, I tried to implement the full stack, that is, both Wi-Fi substitution and substitution, respectively, of all operating system identifiers, which has long been implemented. And if you have noticed, there is also protection against the detection of virtual machines, which now does not pass all the tests. There is no public test at the moment, at least which it would not pass. Well, how this system will show itself in practice, you will find out from the reviews of other users who will already use it starting this Monday. Thank you very much for your attention. You had a Vector T13 with you. And now we move on to the answers to your questions that you may have asked at the beginning of our webinar as well as during this webinar. But our webinar has already exceeded the planned timing by 5 minutes. So I apologize. Unfortunately, I will not be able to answer all the questions, and there are already 167 of them, but I will try to do my best. So let's begin. So let's move on to the questions. Where are our questions? So the first question from user Vanko. Hello, Dimitri. Hello, Vanko. I hope you have a wonderful weekend. I would hope for that too, Vanko. I spent my wonderful Saturday evening in the company of great people who came to listen to my webinar, and this already gives me motivation and strength to make even more interesting products. And I am happy to chat with you. So my weekends, you could say, are great. I set up geolocation with Amazon pre-installed and the option to bypass VM detection in the personal version. The proxy uses IPv6, as you said, but the reCAPTCHA score of 3 is only 01, and 01 just 01. Do you think this somehow affects the C fraud protection system or something else? Because the new Amazon account was blocked very quickly. Thank you for a great webinar today. I can't tell you, unfortunately, in advance. Why? Because, unfortunately, I have very little data. The proxy uses IPv6. In this case, I have the most questions. That is, there are proxies on the market that just show that you have 6 IPVs, and there are ones that allow you to fully work through them. What do you have? And also, who is the source of the proxy data? Because do not forget about one very important method of fraud. If you rent a VPS with an IPv of 6 just from some hosting, you can basically scale that VPS so that you have a huge number of these IPv6 proxies that you can sell. And accordingly, if in this case you had such a selling system, then unfortunately this is an obvious bot pattern. So I recommend paying attention to this, but unfortunately, I repeat, alas, I cannot extract anything more from your message, but more detailed. But also, when you are working with reReCAPTCHA 3, please pay attention to the browser itself. And one more small recommendation, just for the sake of the experiment. Even though the bit system is used to download the Chrome browser, I still recommend trying to download and install it manually through Edge. Well, there are certain kinds of suspicions, let's put it this way. Let's move on. Next question. Question from a Milky Way user. Vector, good afternoon. Good afternoon, Milky Way. Since you mentioned Arch Linux as the best system for anonymization, the question is the system in its system a problematic component for anonymity? The system resolved component, which has a default list of fallback DNS servers, is confusing. Desktop, how much do you think it makes sense to use the simpler OpenRC? Dear Milky Way, you can use absolutely anything. Arch Linux was mentioned by me only because it is archaic, just its simple archaism, there is nothing superfluous there. As for system, what confused you, of course, the developers of this system did not set themselves the task of making the system absolutely anonymous. They have made it, let's say, universal, this is the foundation. And in any case, whatever system you take, I don't know, except for Tails and QX, which I mentioned today, I don't know of a system where you already have some kind of anonymous network pre-installed. It's kind of self-evident that if you bought a car, you need to be able to drive it and at least refuel it. This is the analogy I would bring to the network configuration of the system. Next, a question from a Milky Way user. What was the catch of the questions in the anti-detect for the position of support? They were just questions that were related to history and psychology. You can find a huge number of I've met a huge number of people in my life who are very tech savvy, but are absolute, or it's hard to call it, introverts or unsociable, let's say. And despite the fact that a person can be 7 inches in the forehead, he can be an absolutely complete zero as a support. And at the same time, if a person doesn't show any ambition, for example, I'll be honest, the salaries when the first question was about how long do you have enough to live on? But if a person has enough to live on $1,000 a month, I'm sorry, we don't have anything to worry about. Our paths will definitely not converge together. There were just a few questions, not exactly with a catch, but first of all, I created this test so that it could not be passed with the help of a neural network. That in fact is all. And there was no catch. Next is the next question. Question from a Milky Way user. Here is a Milky Way user who has prepared well for this webinar, which I advise you next time. Will a web resource partnered with Palantir be able to see the approximate route from the source IP in the future? What you're asking has been implemented even before Palantir. I'll explain where it was. The first global IP monitoring system, based on monitoring backbone internet providers, is well known and was called PRISM. And the second system after Prism, and the second system that still exists today, is a system from the NSA called the Treasure Map. You can find information about her, but don't search through neural networks. They won't tell you anything about it. Don't search through Google either, because Google won't give you information. Moreover, he's not providing information, not even from a decade ago. And the information about this treasure map network just appeared somewhere around 2013-2014. Therefore, I recommend using Shodan, or you can find it on the Cypherpunk forums. There is a lot of information about this. So yes, I'm sure that now from Palantir itself, such products already exist. Next is the next question. Question from Milky Way user. Vector, do I understand correctly that CPU, RAM, and SSD performance metrics simply give the most unique identifier for a device, and any JavaScript web resource can determine that two different IPs are the same device? The same identical parameters, e.g., performance. And accordingly, yes. But, I beg your pardon, I'm already a little tired. Accordingly, yes, of course a device can be identified and made unique, but besides all else, it's vital to understand that user experience also contributes, so to speak, to performance load. So, in the short term, 100%, well, no, not 100%, let's be 99. What do I mean? If we try to track the same device by measurements, by labels, by performance measurements, by performance metrics, over the course of, for example, a month, there will be too much variability. And if, for example, we consider the example of a day, then, of course, it is possible to single out a specific device without much difficulty. Next question. Question from Milky Way user. Why is the OnePlus 7 Pro suitable for full disk encryption? What is the peculiarity of this model in contrast to the OnePlus 7T? I usually answer all the questions, but I just want to keep it for myself. Let's say, I can tell you I mentioned it today. That is, it is all related to NVRAM. It seems that the same phone, the same model, just differs only in the index. But here's more, by the way, if you want to be more detailed. NetHunter, a Kali Linux release for mobile devices. Why is NetHunter for the OnePlus 7 Pro and not for the OnePlus 7T? You can Google it. Next is the next question. Question from Richter. Dmitry, greetings. Greetings, Richter. First of all, thank you for the webinars. The last 3 webinars are just... I'm very glad, Richter, that you enjoyed it, because indeed, the month turned out to be very productive. We had 3 webinars during the month, and the webinars were large. For the last webinar, I created about 90 slides. 92 slides, I think. But of course, you need to understand that my workload 10 years ago and my workload now are very different. And therefore, thanks to the fact that an excellent slide automation tool has appeared, I have the opportunity to spend not 3-4 days, as before, but only 1 day to prepare a webinar. And I think that users, if they like my webinars, which are ongoing in the new format, I will hold them more often. Please don't ignore the question. You have a story in your Telegram profile. Your life is beautiful, of course, but one of the posts really interested me. It turns out that you were in the Golden Triangle at the beginning of the 25th year. And at the end of the 25th year, a lot of videos about scam farms from that area appeared on YouTube. When I looked and didn't find a single normal hotel there. Accordingly, the option that reste beste, in general, Richter, I would say that what is now being discussed on YouTube, it has nothing to do with reality, even halfway. I would say so, maybe 30% of reality exists. Here are all these alleged victims, who then give interviews and tell. Oh. Well, as if to put it differently, not everything is so simple. So, as to whether I was there or not, yes, I was there, but I was in the other part. I was present, and at the meeting in Laos. This meeting was on the sale of my business of the past, on the provision of bank cards. And I have nothing to do with scam farms there. Let's move on. Next question. Question from Victor Dudka. Hello, dear Dimitri. Hello, dear Victor Dudka. Can a site scan Wi-Fi hotspots nearby, and what is the best way to scan a virtual machine? What is the best way to work with banks? Is a Jetline router suitable, or should I take a closer look at GeoBox? The answer is both yes and no. Why? Because there is a so-called Geolocation API in browsers, which is based on GPS and Wi-Fi metrics. Therefore, the answer here is yes. As far as I remember, it is impossible to get information about specific networks at the moment. Here, to be honest, I will not lie to you now. Maybe users will write in the comments, but I honestly haven't come across any code that can show the Wi-Fi networks around me. No code for HTML. Well, sorry, maybe I'm mistaken. I'm already a little tired, so sorry. And what is the best way to work with banks? Is Jetline a router suitable, or is it worth taking a closer look at GeoBox? Jetline and GeoBox are top products. Both of these products are really high quality software, so maybe in one of the products you're more comfortable, you'll like the customer support. Maybe in one of the products you'll like the interface more. I recommend taking a closer look at both products, and to be honest, it is very difficult to single out a leader among them. Both products are highly professional and high-tech software. I understood what I had, what was so hard for me. I haven't slept for more than 4 hours for the last week. That's why this is probably the first webinar that wore me out a bit. So the next question. I answered the question from Victor Dudka. Next is the next question. A question from Five Eyes. How to find out your location and some other useful geodata on Android from GeoGuard. What applications or methods exist for testing GeoGuard on Android without signing contracts with GeoComply? Very simple. Take ChatGPT, take the documentation about the Google Geolocation API, and ask ChatGPT to make you a small APK, and accordingly install this APK on your Android. Unfortunately, I don't know any other methods at the moment. Here, but this method is the simplest. Even without programming knowledge, you can write such software in just one evening. Well, or contact some professional, he will write you the same thing in an hour maybe. This is the only way. And about mid meets device integrity meets strong integrity. Use an Android phone from Infinix. There are, of course, more. There are, for example, Pine 3 phones. In general, in principle, there are a lot of different brands of phones that allow you to completely modify yourself, but among all the ones that I have tried, I still prefer, of course, Infinix. Well, again, you need to understand that the price for them is a penny. You can get this phone for $100 and just play. Take it, play, try it. They are sold everywhere. Well, it's not a problem to find them at all. This is not some exclusive product. This is just a Chinese with a good code. Next, a question from the user Kirill. Huge questions. Hello, Vector. Hello, Kirill. I don't know if you can ask so many questions. You can ask so many questions, but I will be grateful if you can answer clearly and briefly. I have 13 of them. Here is the user Milky Way and the user Kirill, perfectly prepared and asked questions in the right timing. So let's begin. On one of the webs, the first question. In one of the previous webinars, you said that Macs before the 17th year are suitable for anonymization or as an anti-detect to bypass anti-fraud systems. Why exactly before the 17th year? And what are the differences after the 17th year? Until the 17th year, Apple Silicon allows itself to be modified. Here's what you can do. And accordingly, if we consider them as an anti-detection, then a modified EFI bootloader that will allow you to change all the information about your PC can help you change Apple Silicon IDs as well. That is, in other words, it is an analog of the TPM chip in Apple devices. It is impossible to do this on subsequent models. Oh, can this be done only on iOS or on other iOS too? I don't know what iOS has to do with it. Sorry, I didn't understand. System 76 is not on Windows either, but you can put anything on System 76. Question 2. Is the Windows generalization procedure better as an anti-detection? Or if not, why not? Generalization may suit local software, but sadly, it's unsuitable for, say, a browser anti-detect. Alas, but again, look, the information is simply outdated. Previously, the generalization procedure was, let's say, a hidden trump card that could be used almost everywhere without any problems at all. But at the moment, alas, in my personal opinion, it is useless. The third question, where to look and how to find techies like you online. Avito, some other bulletin boards, resume sites for job search. What specialty and experience should they have? What criteria should be used to look for them? Kirill, if I knew the answer to this question, I would have no problems with filling the staff of supports. Alas, as practice shows, for so many years it is very difficult to find a person who would be technically savvy, at the same time not an introvert and was comprehensively developed. I don't know what chance it is, 1 in a million. Maybe so. Therefore, unfortunately, I cannot answer this question. Question number 4. At the last webinar, you talked about the ease of determining the anti-fraud system of a particular site. Can one, after defining, understand what it looks at, how it works, what's important to it? Or are these just tests? You can only check the front end, that is, how a web resource interacts with your browser. But the back-end logic of how these parameters are processed, unfortunately, is available only to the creators or owners of this particular anti-fraud system. We can only find out through field tests. Fifth question. You talked about anonymous work on System 76, about disk encryption with plausible deniability. What is it for? To bypass anti-fraud systems or not? Something or what was meant, as I understand it. The technique of plausible denial, it is necessary to preserve the kidneys in the first place. Let me explain. Imagine that there is some person who does not quite agree with the legal system in some country. This person conducts the activity from his laptop. At a certain point, this individual is apprehended by law enforcement officers who then seize and document his laptop before sending it for examination. The examination concludes that, for example, physically, no physical modifications were found. A software set password is, for example, well, not a Windows password, of course, but a password. Presumably, one of the encryption systems of such and such is used. Then, after a while, this inspection protocol goes to the investigator. The investigator does not agree with this and performs the following procedural actions. By psychophysical influence on the suspect, on the detainee in this case, he can, let's say, force him to compromise this password. Since no one will spend resources to crack this password using any technical means if you are in a third world country. Accordingly, the suspect, or rather the detainee, after not quite procedural, but nevertheless psychophysical measures of influence applied to him, will agree to provide this password. The password then is recorded in the criminal case and sent back to the experts, for which the investigator receives an additional, so to speak, reward in the form of preferences from superiors. The expert then inspects the software, specifically the laptop, for any evidence to support the case. That's it. And here lies the most important feature. That the expert will say that there is not a damn thing there. Why does this happen? The fact is that the plausible denial technique allows you to use one area, but encrypted by two different, well, not exactly two different methods, but divided into two different repositories. External and internal. To evade psychophysical pressure and assist the investigation, which might be well received at sentencing but poorly in prison, the suspect provides the laptop password, knowing it contains virtually nothing. Why? Because all information is hidden under a different password. That is, in other words, such a small principle of Matryoshka. And since 1998, when this method of plausible denial was first published, I personally do not know the methods by which this method can be identified. Now, so that's how plausible denial works. Next is question number 6. From the latest webinars also. What does Linux mean the best OS as a base for anonymous work? No, do not confuse warm with soft. Bypassing anti-fraud systems has very little to do with anonymity, because in anonymity we need to hide our identifiers, but nevertheless we can use some, let's say, tricks that will allow us, well, we don't need to show geolocation. We don't need to. We don't need to comply with residential IP, we don't need to comply with WebRTC IP and so on. See? That is, those norms that are mandatory for passing anti-fraud systems are absolutely not necessary for anonymity. Linux is the best system in terms of customization flexibility? Yes. Because of course, if we are now talking about, for example, the Windows 11 operating system as a base, well, it is already very difficult, let's say, to do something more or less clear. On Windows Server, by the way, you can do it very well. Then the 7th question is, processor T1, T2 and Mac, what did you say is a cool thing? Anonymity or bypassing anti-fraud systems? I answered in the context of the answer to about Apple silicone and laptops before the 17th year. Next is the next question from user Rocky7. Is it true that you are Moriarty? There was an investigation in Gozer's group. Your journey coincides with the filming of Moriarty's videos, and so does your figure. I'm sorry, Rocky. I have no connection to this project, and honestly, they're spouting some bullshit. I once came across one video. Well, fuck. Well, let's say, for the average person, it's interesting, but in fact, fuck, well, it's fucked. Alas, where is the world going? Next is the next question. Question from Kirill. What is the difference between anonymity and bypassing anti-fraud systems? I have just answered you literally that in anonymity we can sacrifice what we cannot sacrifice in anti-fraud systems. That is, we cannot declare our IPv6 address, we can disable the UDP protocol, we cannot show geolocation, we can do a lot of things to be more or less similar to the rest of the crowd, but nevertheless not show too much. Ninth question, on which sites to look basically? Have the parameters changed? Is everything fine? There is the Lix browser, the Scan browser, the Pixel Scan browser, and so on. Shit in my opinion, and why do we need them if they're shit? Let's turn on the logic now. If we go to Pixel Scan and open a WebRTC internals Chrome tab, at the same time we see a WebRTC connection. Everything is cool, everything is super, there are no problems in this. But we see a connection to the TreatMetrics servers, which I have already talked about many times. And if we go to TreatMetrics, read their rules, then in order to conclude a contract, it is necessary to disclose the counterparty. In other words, you cannot conclude a contract for one site, but use TreatMetrics on another site. Do you understand what I am talking about? Accordingly, TreatMetrics knows that their anti-fraud system is used on the Pixel Scan checker. Is it necessary to draw a logical parallel further or not? What do you think? But that's up to you. And where to check? Well, first of all, if you want to check so much, I don't know. For example, before, until the recent, well, I don't know how many years, maybe there, the fuck knows, how long I have not actually used any checkers, except for self-written ones. The simplest option, want to check? Well, I've already shared many checkers in my webinars in groups. That is, you can simply open this web resource on your own local computer and check yourself. At the same time, it is your personal checker, it does not knock anywhere with 100% probability. It is absolutely open, there are no problems with it. Plus, well, again, neural networks, they will make you any checker in a few minutes, and you don't need to bother yourself thinking about whether this or that checker is legitimate or not. Why do we need these same pixel scans? Well, there is a wonderful honeypot. Why? Well, I've told you. What are the real goals? Here you can talk in completely different ways. Alas, we, except for the creators of this checker, do not know the real goals. But it is a fact that the anti-fraud system they use is the top in the world. It is a fact that this anti-fraud system necessarily needs to know which resource it connects to. That they know about it is a fact. And such an anti-fraud system sits and thinks, hey fuck, why not fucking make a fuss, huh? Some kind of fuss. Let's throw all our data into the public. Fuck, let people bitch check, right? Well, fuck, well, how's that? Well, it doesn't fit into my head, fuck. 10th question. Sorry for the emotions. 10th question. Are there any sites that allow you to determine the fraud score of each profile reliable? 11th. How do they fire, and do they fire the incognito mode in the Safari browser if you register the bookmaker's office from it, for example? As for it, there is the same hardware, the same iPhones of the same models, cookies are not saved. It seems that Apple's privacy policy is such that it is not allowed there. Well, if you think so, then you have now opened Pandora's box and you have solved all the problems of anti-detectors. It turns out that you just need to turn on incognito mode on your Apple device. Well, check. Well, it should work. You will tell the result later at the next webinar. 12th, what happens if you go to fingerprint.com? How to understand what information about you is, okay, it's not good, sorry. What happens if you go to the fingerprint.com? Where does he leak data to the bookmaker's office? What should I do after the entry if this happens? He does not need to leak data anywhere. Thanks to their architecture of work, the web resources that real users will then go to, or you will go to, if they enter the fingerprint.com orbit, they will see that you have already visited their checker. They will see your data from the IP, fuck, and other data of people who are not clear why. What the fuck are you trying to find on these checkers? Tell me. Maybe I'll look for something there too. Fuck, maybe I'll find money there. Fuck, maybe I'll find the fucking meaning of life there. Fucking mouth, fuck it, well, honestly. Well, enough already. Well, fuck, turn on critical thinking. Fucking case, fuck. How to understand what information an application or website asks for about you. Conduct an analysis. Next question. Question from Five Eyes. How do I test GSM geolocation for free? There is no way you can test GSM geolocation. This is visible. This information is visible to the operator, or it is visible through the SS7 stack by executing a VLR request. Visitor location registry request. But VLR queries are not supported in all networks, not by all cellular operators. But in principle, you can find services. The previous service that performed VLR requests is called Text Cloud. You can use Wi-Fi networks via the Google database. On a phone, as I told your colleague, you'd need to write an Android app. If for a computer, you can download the app and spy Wi-Fi for free from the detect.expert website. Blessing 3/8. Love you, Dimitri. Love you, Blessing 888. Further, Viktor Dudka. What about the people who got into the second round of the support competition? You'll receive the assignment tomorrow in private from me. Next is the next question. So flood. Danilko, hello. What can you say about the use of Starlink, anonymity, and confidentiality? Dandaniko, I will say that there is neither anonymity nor confidentiality. If we consider satellite internet, there's only one device. And here it is written in the chat. Only this device can provide you with a certain level of anonymity. Let's move on. Next question. Question from Arizona user. Dimitri, please tell me what anti-fraud system is used in Amazon Netherlands and what is it based on? Amazon Netherlands, as in the rest of Amazon, uses the Amazon Fraud Detector system, their own, which has connections to reCAPTCHA 3 and to MaxMa-Indo. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your webinars. Very cool. I've been following you since 2021. Super. 4 years is already an excellent result. Even 5, in fact. I am glad that my webinars please you. Next question. Question from Arizona user. Dimitri, is there any positive feedback that your camera replacement is much better than a rooted Android device with firmware, for example, Verifus? I want to leave a pleasant review. Keep up the good work. It's a pleasure to listen to you. You motivate. I'm glad I'm motivating you. As for Verifus, unfortunately, I am not familiar with these devices, why they are interesting, but if it is, figuratively speaking, some kind of multi-model firmware, then I have questions about it. I've talked about Android more than once today. Unfortunately, I repeat, I am not familiar with the Verifus system. And whether mine is better or not, I just implemented the camera. So far, this camera only works in photo format. I haven't finished the video with it yet. The desire to do is everything, but unfortunately, it is limited by the fact that most of the technologies that I use in anti-detect were not invented by anyone before me. And you can't even steal something, you have to write everything from scratch. Next is a question from the user Arizona. I think that the new video guide and this video guide will be the final one for the 5th part of Anti-Detect, will be released in mid-February since a big update for Antica is planned. And in addition, it is necessary to show how the same Android and Chrome OS start. So, not before an update for Android. The second question, when is Antica planned for release on version 6? I think not earlier than May of this year, because we are waiting for many fixes directly from Oracle, and they are not very fast in this regard. And what they wanted to implement, for example, in November last year, they implemented only now in the update that came out yesterday. So, alas, there is a certain dependency here, because to find developers who understand devices, drivers, and virtualization, well, these developers are worth their weight in gold. By the way, if we have such in the chat here, be sure to write to me in a PM. Old CookieBot, as I understand it, is no longer an active technology. Your project is great. Please go on, don't stop. Old CookieBot, I reported that it is not relevant yet. The project will continue and will not stop. How long has it already existed? Since 2017. 9 years? The anti-detect project is 9 years old? It's cool! Next, again, a question from user Arizona. Dimitri, you are launching your new author's course tonight. Please tell us in more detail what will be on the course. Will a separate Telegram group be created where you will share insiders? Your followers love you very much. True, maybe not as much as in the Netherlands, but still sincerely. Thank you for your kind words. To be honest, I'll be honest. Due to the huge download from Antica, I haven't visited the Fraud Lab group for a long time. So I need to post an update, but damn fly, I don't have enough for everything. So I'll try very hard now to finish with type number 9 and literally within a couple of days return to the group and answer all current questions, and please with new content that has already been recorded. It remains only to mount it a little. So there is already a separate group, and the course is described on the detect.expert website. So, the next question. Question from Dante Alighieri. Greetings, dear Vector and dear friends. Dima, do you have at least a drop of conscience? You can go to the detect.expert website and download it, and, accordingly, work with it. Stop offending your friends, and don't do it very meanly based on Linux cast antic. Here, I'd better tell you about TPM. Next question. We missed the flood. Arizona user, this applies to you. MMDEMS user. Hello MMDEMS. First, the impact of my internet speed in anti-fraud systems. What should be the minimum? There is only a definition that a proxy is used based on speed, but I have only seen this in the Xeon anti-fraud system. I haven't seen it anywhere else, so I can't say. Maybe on the back end, logic is present in self-written systems, but I haven't seen it in public systems. Although, to be honest, I'm lying. Threat metrics is present, but I honestly don't remember the meanings for you now. Further, transfer of Antica to bare metal in the EU. What are the nuances on the part of detect.expert? Everything will work much better for you. The main thing is not to forget that the RDP protocol disables 3D acceleration, so it is better to either work through alternative sources of remote administration or start a virtual machine and then connect via radmin. You can do this thanks to the API without any problems. Next, my problem is the small bandwidth, under the proxy even less. The level of 4Gs is up to 50 megabits per second, and the average in a large US city is 3000. The difference is several times. I am sure that the current lecture was cool, like the previous ones. Thank you very much, but when you move yourself to the USA, you will lose this problem, and your speed will be enough for you to connect remotely. The main thing is that the proxy endures. So, GlitterDef. Vector, do I have a question about Pamper besides Akamai? In fact, you could do a lot of things, but there are tasks of higher priority. So, the next question. Question from user Noir. Чи є якісь гайдичі способи заразити проходити як невірки на сервісах, де вимагають само селфі-відео? Шановний Norm, you can easily see the NVIDIA's 5090 video card, and the one system is 2 specs 2. With this system, you can fully simulate any persona, even for Know Your Customer services. You will lose only one problem. The problem with the color version, if you are to reap your monitor, to apply, demonstrate different colors in order to rejuvenate, redress on your appearance. It can be a problem. Тож, використовуйте інші. I don't have another way. Next is the next question. Question from Young. You often show how anti-fraud systems work. Why do classic anti-detect browsers give a false sense of security? If we imagine that we have a legal white project with a high sensitivity to risks, fintech, insurance, medicine, what 3-5 principles do you consider to be minimally sufficient for the anonymity architecture and operational security of the team to reduce the likelihood of de-anonymization of key people to minimize leaks? Let me explain why. There are too many unknown variables in your equation. Therefore, I would advise as the first principle, I would advise principle number 1, as the second principle, principle number 2, and as the third principle, principle number 3. Well, this is about the answer, respectively, on your question. Alas, if you want, you can contact me for a personal consultation, where I will do my best to help in resolving your issue. And again, a question from user Norm. Are there better deepfake tools than Deep Live Cam available on detect.expert and GitHub? I've already answered that. One 2.1 and the first letter W. Next question. Чи є якась цікава інінація про лівнес під час перевірки селфі-відео for Know Your Customer? Know Your Customer – це дуже вразлива тема. Я не дуже хочу у публіку про неї казати. So the next question. Question from Miazar. Hello, Dmitry. Hello, Miazar. What type of connection and software other than OpenVPN would you recommend using inside a virtual machine? Oh, but what type of connection? Use virtual routers. This is the coolest option. Just today, people were talking about routers like, for example, Jetline. Great product. I'd mention GeoBox now, certainly, but GeoBox is a physical device, meaning it's a Raspberry Pi, and might not be convenient for everyone. Or maybe, for example, people are not comfortable with a virtual router that needs to be run in a virtual machine. It is easier for them to work with a physical device. Therefore, different methods. Just use what you like. And a question from user Vic. Hello, tell me which system is better for bypassing anti-fraud. Windows 10 or Windows 11? Windows 11. Next question. Question from user 1. I want to get a Windows 11 grandfather and connect to it through my secure communication channel to be more anonymous. What good options are there for limits? Home through at home, city, and via the internet? What do our experts think? Alas, unfortunately, I cannot understand the question. I understand that you want to have a grandfather. I understood how to connect to it through my secure communication channel. Okay. But what do city limits, houses, and interiors have to do with it? I regrettably don't understand. What does KVM have to do with it? It's a virtualization tool. There is definitely no information about this in the Anonymity course. Alas, I did not understand the question. Excuse me. Wolf. What is the best way to enter information security from scratch officially, and is it worth doing it? Is it worth being a doctor? Is it worth being a boxer? Is it worth being an astronaut? Well, everyone decides for themselves. For me, for example, it's not a job, it's my life. And despite the fact that, let's say, life can be monetized in different ways, I'll tell you so. That's why I know a lot of techies who can barely make ends meet and who are brilliant techies. But they just don't want to even work. Well, that's how, I don't know, complex matter is the meaning of life. What is the best way to enter? Oh, you need to start with an understanding of the basics of at least how a computer works. Therefore, find books dated the beginning of the 2000s about the structure of the computer. At least this is where we need to start, because otherwise... Yes, it is clear that in order to build a house, it is not important to know from what, how bricks are made, or how cement is made, but the general principles of understanding are for you. They definitely won't hurt. Next question. Question from Vic. Why does run as vector T13 appear in the context menu when installing anti-detect? I no longer have the option run as administrator. Because Vic, you don't have an admin anymore, you now have a vector T13 on your computer. Have you ever wondered where I get my proxies? It's a botnet, the detect.expert botnet. Go to the registry and change it to yourself as you want. At least to launch the Duma from Fashion, damn. You know, alright. How do I test Android for simulators and emulators with anti-simulator and anti-emulator software? Hello. User, hello. Thank you for your work and thank you for coming to my webinar. Tell me, when will you be able to give access to cybercrime? Since November, I have been waiting for the opening of access. The conditions for purchasing the personal version have been met. Let's figure it out. Write to me in a PM and we will resolve this issue, but not earlier than Monday. I warn you right away. I'll ask the support for your data. It will probably be easier this way. Oh, further. Next question. Question from user Nar. Hello, Vector. What's the anonymity advantage of Chrome OS over Windows? None. Complete bullshit in terms of anonymity. Given the low popularity of the system, there is a risk of attracting unnecessary attention. For example, banking or large transactions on Chrome OS. It looks atypical, since the main audience of the system is students. Won't it look suspicious for monitoring systems? Anonymity and anti-fraud systems are different things. For anti-fraud systems, Chrome OS flies perfectly. For anonymity, it is not suitable from the word at all. Next is a question from user Nar. Has Android from Vector will have spoofing of surrounding Wi-Fi points and geolocation? So, let's probably have just a couple more questions now, and we'll end with our current webinar, because we're already approaching a 3-hour timing, just like we did last webinar. So, the next question, this one is from user Nar. Why is virtual card type universal only in the United States? When will there be European station wagons? At the moment we already have a turnover, well, now it's January, the turnover has fallen a little, but in principle, last year by December, we had already reached $250,000 in turnover per day. And so far, we want to at least maintain this turnover, so as not to fall into some kind of mistake. Therefore, for the time being, we are working with, relatively speaking, a reinforced concrete foundation, and we are certainly planning to expand it, but I cannot tell you exactly when. Question from Gold User. Will there be geolocation spoofing in Android Anti-Detect? Yes, but GPS is already working, but Wi-Fi has not yet been implemented. But I think that in principle, this will not be a big problem with the current developments for Windows. And one more question from user Nar. On the site in the education section, I had ethical hacking, but the lessons do not open. writes error 200, 2061. Something is uploaded. What is uploaded to Vimeo works. They couldn't solve the problem with support. Can you fix it? I will ask the supports and will definitely give feedback at the next webinar, or it will just work for you. Dear friends, that's probably all because the questions are not decreasing. Yes, there were 167 of them, 135 left. I don't know how much I answered, but at this hour, I tried to invest as much as possible. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope you enjoyed my presentation. I will be glad if you publish your review either on YouTube or in our Telegram groups. This will motivate me to make the next webinar on the 12th simply legendary. Thank you very much. I will delight you with good content. I wish you all a pleasant Saturday evening. Take care. Vector T13 was with you.